Today's guest has an interesting way of answering the how questions. How can my voice be heard? How can I help end racism? For Loki Mulholland, activism began early as the son of civil rights legend Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. Yet it didn't end there. Today, he continues his mother's legacy educating students about the civil rights movement and making a difference through the educational nonprofit organization, the Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation. As an Emmy-winning filmmaker, he uses his talents and platform to capture stories of triumph and bravery, including the story of his mother and her courageous fight for civil rights. Overall, he is an example of how we can and do make a difference by making our voices heard. Hi, I'm Morgan Authman, and I'm happy you could join us for another Cool Talk conversation. When was the first time you were introduced to race?
Wow. First you have to understand is white people don't see race in the same way that everyone else does, because we don't see ourselves as a race. We define everyone else around us because we are the norm. And then, there's race, and then, which is a social construct, of course, in and of itself. And then there's color. Every kid sees color. That's why this whole notion that you're colorblind, I don't see color, really? I mean, how's that possible? But at a very early age, kids see the difference, right? They just don't put social attributes on that. I think the first time that I kind of confronted it in a sense was probably when I was about 9 years old or so. And I remember my mother went to Tougaloo College, which is HBCU in Tougaloo, Mississippi. And they had alumni get-togethers, barbecues every summer. And I remember this one summer we went, and that was the summer that I kind of looked around and was like, wait a second, we're the only white people here. So I became like self-aware in that respects. But again, for me, it was, understand this perspective is that I'm seeing everyone else as being different. Because again, not understanding the dynamics of it like I do today, but my society, the way everything is presented to me, that I am the norm because, white people have created that. In respects of being kind of an awareness of a profiling of what was really going on in society was later on when I was maybe about 22. I remember this distinctly. I was driving down the road with a friend of mine named Terrence Brown, big Jamaican guy. And we were actually going to a recording session. And this is going through DC, this little beat up little car. So you got me, this little white guy, and Terrence, this big black guy, driving down the road. And all of a sudden this cop starts to follow us. And I've become really kind of aware that this is actually taking place. I'm starting to get a little paranoid. I'm making sure I stop at the yellow. If the light's turning yellow, I'm slowing down to make sure I don't go through it. And, I've got my turn signal on and doing all these things. And the cop's still kind of just making, just following us. I turned to Terrence and I said, gosh, I think this cop's following us. He just looked at a side mirror and then, looked ahead and said, yeah, it happens to me all the time.
So in other words, white people are supposed to be introduced to race because they are the norm?
I mean, to me, white is normal in respects that, the irony of it all is that whites are minority in the world. Yeah, but you take a look at Hollywood. Hollywood's doing a lot more work to diversify their content, right? To have more people of color in film. And even just the slightest bit and white people freak out. The idea that maybe Captain America could be black, right? All of a sudden, all these sort of things, it's because everything is around us, meaning white people. And so we start to freak out when we see things that are different, because everything has told us. Our history books have told us, because look at your history books. Anything of accomplishment in American history, of course, is white people, right? Yeah. We're going to throw a few bones out there. You got your George Washington Carvers and your Bannekers and so forth. But you're always going to have an exception. For example, you get people who you'll see a list. Like there's these great lists of black inventions and black inventors. And a normal white person will look at that and go, because it's like some sort of like some sort of social media thing, some meme or whatever. They start to question this idea that these are even possible, that anything good we must have done. and that's why also, that we struggle so much talking about slavery, because we do such great things. Well, slavery is obviously evil and horrible and everything else. And so, well, but we were good slave owners, right? The happy slave narrative, the good slave owner is just, it's obviously it's utter nonsense. But that's just because we're so used to seeing ourselves, because we've created that world for ourselves to make everyone else also see us that way. And that's why you get different places around the world, whether it be in Africa or Asia, where you get whitening one's skin. There's literally, you go on Google or Amazon, you'll find whitening products. Now they call them different things, but they're whitening products, particularly in Korea. That's a big thing right now. To look more porcelain, to look more white, because white is, the epitome of beauty and whatever else.
In a June 2020 interview, you mentioned your mother standing during Lift Every Voice and Sing at the Civil Rights Museum and her calling it a national anthem. What is your stance on the social requirement to say the pledge and stand during the national anthem?
So one is, Lift Every Voice and Sing. So that was at the, at the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, the only state-sponsored civil rights museum in the entire country, and it's in Mississippi. And she stood. Now this is, Lift Every Voice and Sing is also known as the Negro National Anthem. It's a traditional name. And so all of a sudden she looks around and she's the only person standing. And so eventually someone else stands, African-American woman there. I stood because I was like, well, my mom's just giving me the eye. And eventually everyone stood up, right? And then she made sure that she went to Jerry Mitchell, a reporter, said, hey, by the way, did you notice who stood up? It was the white woman that stood up first. She always makes this little thing about it. But she's like, look, this is an anthem. You stand for anthems, whether it's the Soviet anthem or wherever, you show respect for that. And so, but there's also that form of protest. So for me in the Pledge of Allegiance, I actually use the Pledge of Allegiance when I speak a lot, particularly with students, because when you consider the words, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, for the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'm like, I have the kids recite that, and I just say, hey, look, that liberty and justice for all, you just made a commitment to civil rights. That's what that means. Liberty and justice for all. You've just made a commitment. And if you're not willing to make that commitment, then why say it? Otherwise, it's just rote words and such. This is what our republic stands for. This is what we should stand for, because we just made that pledge. I don't get into those sort of things in respects of actually saying them and so forth. The national anthem, again, I will stand, but I don't put my hand over my heart. I don't do those sort of things. It's just those sort of things I understand the psychology around them in respects to, creating greater unity within our nation and so forth. But I also see that as this form of nationalism. We didn't always used to do that. I mean, for goodness sakes, when my mother went to school, in elementary school, they used to sing Dixie. So what does that tell you about the national anthem? It's just a regional thing that's become a national thing. So, but in particular, at this time in particular, I just choose to let my voice, my silence be my voice in that regards. Now, I respect those who serve, Medgar Evers, for example, served in the military and those, they were fighting for these rights. Obviously they didn't get them when they got home, but they worked to get them. And you recognize those sort of things and you can appreciate that, but also we live in America. We have that right to do that, whether because of our religious choices or whatever else. That's the beauty of our system. And to shoot down, figuratively or literally, anyone who is exercising their rights as an American to have agency, to do, what they wish within the limits of the law, of course. It smacks of un-American. It's un-American to not allow someone to exercise their freedoms.
Are there any other pieces of history that you wish you would have mentioned in your documentary, An Ordinary Hero?
Well, the problem is my mom is that, she only tells you what you ask, so I remember it was a couple of years afterwards, there was an article about my mom, and it was like, yeah, she did this and did that, it was this standard stuff. And then it said, and she marched in the Selma to Montgomery March. And I'm like, wait, and I was like, oh, well, they got something wrong again, because they always do. So I asked her about that. I said, oh yeah, you won't believe this, Mom, but they said you marched in the Selma to Montgomery March. And she's like, well, I did. I'm like, what, really? You couldn't have told me that? There's always something more. To tell. There was plenty of stories in the film that we didn't share. We captured like good gracious, I think like 14, added up 12 to 14 hours of interviews with my mom, just my mother. And most of the stories you don't even hear about, because they just don't fit what was needed for the narrative to carry the story forward. There's a lot of just different little things along the way and so forth. And there's always more things I hear about. My mom was, I was having this conversation with her, and she was talking about how she was visiting some place up in Baltimore, and this guy came up to her and pulled out this piece of paper and says, do you recognize this? And she says, well, yeah, well, it's my handwriting. He says, yeah, this was after a sit-in. So this was back in the 60s, and he kept this. It was a note that he had passed to this guy while they were sitting in the church for the mass meeting after the protest. And I was like, when were you protesting in Baltimore? I guess she also got arrested or something. But when were you protesting there? And she goes, I don't remember. Just ask the FBI. There's always something new to hear from my mom in that regard. So yeah, at some point you have to kind of just end it and then move forward. It's like with The Uncomfortable Truth, or the film that I did about voter suppression after Selma. It's at some point you just have to kind of, okay, there's always gonna be something more and more and more to add. You just have to kind of know how to wrap it up. And give people that opportunity to go, wow, okay, what else is going on? And so they can take that information and add to it themselves.
Well, I'm sure working alongside your mother has its own challenges and blessings. Since she does work in civil rights, is there any other work that you think you should be doing?
There's everything's interconnected. I mean, yeah, I would love to do stuff, when it comes to the environment or, housing. Right. There's a lot of different little issues I would like to tackle, but there's other people who are doing that already. And I have a unique position being the son of, Joan Trumpauer. And so that's given me that platform and the skills that I have to address that. And so, but everything's interconnected as well. The oppression of one is the oppression of all. And so when whether it's LGBTQ or women's rights or voting rights or, housing, all of that's all interconnected with civil rights and equal rights and racism. So we all have a part to play in that. And so this is the lane that for now has, become the focus. And that seems to be what people want to hear, from me in particular. Just because of my unique, position of the work that I've done, the people I've been able to interview, the research and everything else. So,
well, you also mentioned that white people are responsible for the creation of white supremacy, and if they are responsible for it, then they should be responsible for ending it. For an ordinary white American citizen, what is one thing that they can do to destroy those racial barriers?
One thing in particular is to be, it's not enough to say that you're not a racist. You need to be against racism. Be willing to speak out. Be willing to educate yourself. You can't speak about being anti-racist without educating yourself. If you believe that you're not a racist, then prove it. When you're in that situation, you need to be prepared to do something about it because you are against it, right? And you're not that, so you're obviously against it. And so show it. Be prepared. Teach your kids. I get people, I don't teach my kids to be racist. I'm like, I believe that. There's not too many people who are out there, telling their kids how to put on a Klan robe and burn a cross. I mean, that just doesn't really happen, right? It's very, very small. But do you teach your kids not to be racist? Because there's a difference. You have to be active in that and be honest about it, not make excuses. Well, that was in the past. Well, yes, it was. I get people who will say to me like, well, there was slavery in Africa. Well, yeah, okay, there was. There's slavery all over the world, but we live in America. So let's talk about that because we don't talk about it and what that means and the impact of all of those policies. how that flowed into Jim Crow. Yeah, okay, slavery ended, but you know what? We had Jim Crow, and you know what? Jim Crow ended, but you know what? We had the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And when you start connecting the dots for people, they start to see it. But again, that's being educated about it, and speaking up and speaking out, and getting uncomfortable. That's really the next step. That's what my mother did. You know, she went out of her way, you know, to get uncomfortable and she did it because it was the right thing to do. You know, that's what you do. When it was the right thing to do, you do it. And we know instinctively what is right and what is wrong. The challenge becomes is actually acting on that, is having the courage to do that. And so that's really, if that one thing, again, it's being anti-racist. Have the courage, get the knowledge, and then just go and do it. Doesn't mean every day you got to be out there on Facebook. You don't got to every time, you know, but you'll be aware, right? So when you're in a store and you see a situation, you know, you're willing to step up and not step back.
To learn more, visit the Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation's website. There you can find educational resources, the Uncomfortable Truth podcast, as well as the documentaries An Ordinary Hero, The Uncomfortable Truth, and After Selma, directed by Loki Mulholland, Joan's son. You can also donate to the cause.